welcome. I'd like to get us started. We have a wonderful program tonight and a lot of territory to cover. For those of you joining us on Zoom, it's nice to have you with us. You will be muted during the presentation, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. I just have a few announcements, as always. Thursday, May 18th, that's a week from today, is the Edith Chase Symposium. We are co-sponsors for that event, and it's held in the Architecture Building on campus. There's a lot of parking right across the street at the Fashion Museum parking lot. This year's speaker is Mary Mertz, and she's talking about invasive species in Ohio. Next, please mark your calendars for Saturday, June 3rd. This is going to be our annual meeting, which we have annually. It's very important because we're going to elect officers, we're going to approve the budget, and we're going to approve our program for the coming year. We also have a dynamic speaker. His name is Aaron Ackerman, and he's the Executive Director for the Ohio Association of Election Officials. And I have heard him speak, you obviously have as well, and he's wonderful. So we're starting at 8:45 on Saturday, June 3rd at the United Methodist Church in Kent. This is a potluck brunch, and in keeping with our environmental position, we ask everyone to bring your own table place settings. So if you can do that and join us, we would love to have you. Next, Thursday, July 13th is our next all-member meeting. It will be here, and you'll get more information about that as we approach the date. Finally, please mark on your calendar August 8th. August 8th is the day voters will choose whether we're going to keep or eliminate direct democracy in Ohio. If you haven't heard what happened yesterday, just check the news. So from here until August 8th, all the leagues in Ohio are going to be extremely busy. It's going to be all hands on deck. You're going to hear about this very soon, and we're going to recruit everybody because we need to all be involved in saving our democracy. So with that happy note, Kim, if you'll introduce Cynthia.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation about education in Ohio. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee decided to make K-12 education this year's focus because so much has been going on in state legislatures around the country. The fact that the Kent Interfaith Alliance for Racial Reconciliation and Justice hosted a series of panels on the intersection of race and education in Kent City schools that gave us insight into the issue locally also made the topic a natural choice. We're going to start off with a look at what's going on with a group called Honesty for Ohio Education, and then I will be summarizing our committee's takeaways from the first three KIFA panels. There's going to be time for questions after both halves of tonight's programs. To all those who are attending on Zoom, please know that Zoom is going to be muted, so put any questions you would like to submit in chat. We're going to have a committee member monitoring the chat and then passing them along. All right, so I'm here to introduce Cynthia Peeples. She's the founding director of Honesty for Ohio Education, a nonpartisan statewide coalition that educates and advocates for honest, inclusive education in K-12 and higher ed spaces. The League of Women Voters of Ohio is an official partner of Honesty for Ohio Education. Cynthia also serves on the state board of the League of Women Voters of Ohio and the Akron Civic Theater. She also co-chairs the Akron NAACP Act So program. Cynthia moved into the advocacy world while working as a news anchor and reporter in Texas, marrying her passion for storytelling and social justice. Take it away.
Great. Hey everybody. I know many of you from many different league spaces, so it's so nice to see all of you physically in person. Sally and I, gosh, we toiled for years over DEI in a virtual program that started during COVID, so it's so nice to see you in person.
Nice to see you too.
Yeah. Okay, so folks, buckle up. I'm gonna give you a lot of information by fire hose. We're gonna cover a lot of information. I've got flyers over here that have QR codes, and I've got some table placards. The best way to follow what we're doing and in the Honesty Coalition is to zap one of these QR codes so that you can join our mailing list, and then your inbox will get flooded with all kinds of information that's not related to democracy, kind of, but adjacent. So I am Cynthia Peeples, she, her pronouns. I am the founding director of Honesty for Ohio Education and state board member, as in my intro. I want to give you a little bit of background about the Honesty Coalition. We are a nonpartisan statewide coalition. I hope I'm not in your way. At this point, we represent nearly 70 organizational partners across the state of Ohio and across the country. You can see just a handful, literally just a handful of those partners over here. I do want to point out that our 3 core founding partners were League of Women Voters Ohio, ACLU Ohio, and Policy Matters Ohio. In fact, I came into the coalition while I was doing advocacy work for League of Women Voters Ohio, and League served as a very important incubator for the coalition. And I really cut my teeth on advocacy in the League of Women Voters Ohio. So the League serves so many different purposes outside of democracy. It teaches all of us how we can civically engage, take that toolkit and take it into other areas of passion that are important to us outside of redistricting, redistricting and resolutions against constitutional amendments. Our 3 core pillars in the Honesty Coalition are to educate, advocate, and build community around ensuring every student receives a high-quality education that's grounded in truth, facts, and diverse perspectives. We also work to ensure that every student and educator, their lived experiences, their cultures, and their background are affirmed in the classroom. And we also work to ensure, most importantly right now, that their rights and their safety are protected in the classroom, in their districts, and in their communities. If you're following any of the news, particularly around our LGBTQ+ students, you know that they are really in the crosshairs of a lot of hate and harm right now. And we also work very hard to build community because we know all of us need to come together to wrap our arms around our students and our educators right now. And we do that building community in a number of different ways, which I'll touch on. And we do this very important work at 3 critical access points to public education. And these 3 spaces are so important, and we have to do this in concert, and we have to do it at the same time. We do this work at the State House, at the State Board of Education, and in our local school districts. The hate and harm feels the same, it feels similar, but they come in different ways, and we have to advocate around those issues in very different ways than we do at the State House, at the State Board, and in our local school districts. It looks different. It feels the same, but it is different. And some of this work we do in a number of different ways by providing a lot of resources, information, updates, up to the minute news about what's happening around public education in Ohio, programs. Reach out to us, ask us to come speak at your group, in your community, your neighborhood. We have to get this information and news out. And then we also teach communities how to organize around these issues as well. Okay, so tonight what I want to do is I want to lead off with what our vision for public education is, because it's so important to ground this conversation around what our common values and our common goals are for public education. And then I'm going to talk about what the state of education is across the country, and then we're going to zoom it in to what's happening here in Ohio, and we're going to talk about the 3 threats to honest education in Ohio at the State House, at the State Board of Education, and in our local school districts. And then we're going to land with what we all as leaguers can do, and then how you all individually can go into your own neighborhoods, communities, your families, your business groups, your faith groups, and then mobilize people in those networks as well. And I'm going to leave you with a lot of links and a lot of resources. Okay. So you all know what I've learned, and it's been 2 years of growing pains and joy in building this coalition, is in messaging around any kind of advocacy, there's a very specific framework to use, and we call it the 3 V's, and some of you may be familiar with this. You start with your values. You bring everyone into the conversation. Where do we find connections? Where do we bond as humans and as people that are raising families? And then you identify the villains that are providing obstacles and hurdles to achieving those values. And then you land with what our collective vision to getting to that goal, where we're all living in our values together. So it's VVV, value, villains, and then your vision. Okay, so at Honesty, like I said, we're a coalition representing more than 70 organizational partners, and we worked really hard to really narrow and sharpen what our 5 core common beliefs are with all these different organizations and all of these different communities sitting at the table. And we all collectively believe that every child deserves an honest, high-quality education. Yes, we all want that for our children. We also believe that education must reflect and celebrate all identities in the classroom, experiences, and cultures in order to maximize student engagement and their achievement. We also believe, and this is where League is really sharpening their saw and building their muscles around DEI. We also believe that dismissing racism and discrimination, or even trying to minimize or whitewash the trauma and impact, irrevocably harms individuals and communities and ultimately prevents those pathways to learning, healing, and growth. And we know, and this is very important, that students benefit most when there are community partnerships, family partnerships, and education partnerships. Everybody needs to come together, this village mentality about raising and educating our students. And this includes students, this includes families, this includes our educators, this includes our dedicated school boards and earnest policymakers on the right side of history, not right in terms of political affiliation, but on the right side of honest education. And then finally, the way we define honest education is that freedom of critical thinking, that deep reflection about what you're learning, a very diverse, robust exchange of ideas, even those that are different from your own, because we know all of this is essential for achieving Ohio's vibrant future and ultimately securing that high-functioning multiracial democracy that we see slipping through our fingers right now. We are living at the intersection of education and democracy right now, and when one is on fire, the other one is on fire. So we all need to come together and rally around. We know that education is the bedrock of a high-functioning democracy. Our electorate needs to be informed and educated. We don't all necessarily have to think the same. In fact, we're stronger when we don't, when we all bring different viewpoints and experiences to the table. But we all have to be able to access the same levers of democracy and have access to high-quality education to get there. Okay, so because I'm a leaguer and because I started doing a lot of DEI work when I first got involved in the League of Ohio, I thought it would be pretty germane to talk about what League considers DEI. And I just pulled out some very specific points here. If you head over down here on the bottom, there's a link down here, and I'll share this slide deck when we're done. Everything in yellow is hyperlinked. I pulled this information off of LWV US's resources and page around DEI. Sally, I know you know this. But specifically, this is very important, around diversity and education. Diversity includes, and I'm just going to jump over to the highlighted area, this also includes Black Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, AAPI for short, that's where I live, people with disabilities, and people experiencing poverty, and LGBTQIA+ communities as well. And like I said, there is so much harm, especially in education, that is directed at this community. And then when we're talking about equity, again, pulling out that excerpt, Equity prioritizes efforts to ensure that the most underserved and marginalized among us, that they each have an opportunity to succeed, and at the most well-served and advantaged. And then as far as inclusion, we want to make sure that everyone feels safe, respected, engaged, motivated, and valued for who they are. And this is what we also work for in the Honesty Coalition. Okay, so we know why I'm here, we know why you're here, we all have the same common values with League. Well, let's look at how the Ohio Department of Education views education as well. This is ODE's 5-year strategic plan for education, and it is layered with equity. At the center of the plan is a whole child approach to education, which is wrapping its arms around the child and is taking it away from this narrow focus on academic outcomes to helping children developing into full, thriving adults. So it's looking at the whole child, not just what they look like on a report card. And this is so important. This plan was beautiful. This plan was constructed over years. We did an entire 2-part program on it, Sally. ODE went around the entire state of Ohio, did a lot of listening sessions, town halls, focus groups to understand what each school district and community across Ohio needed from public education. And this is what they took out of it from all of those listening sessions. And the core recurring theme was equity. And one of the 3 core principles in this plan is equity. And here's the whole child framework. I'm not going to unpack it because we don't have a lot of time. But what I did want to show you is that the student is at the center, looking at the color coding. The family is completely wrapped around the student, if you look at that burgundy color, and then all of these gorgeous spokes around the whole child. Social emotional learning, cultural proficiency, mental health supports, making sure that that child is fed and served and recognized for who they are and what they bring into the classroom, and then those community partnerships. And Children's Defense Fund Ohio, who's one of our dear partners, and Baldwin Wallace, they put out a survey across the state of Ohio to understand what do families really want for their child in public education. Are they afraid of teachers? Do they feel that teachers are indoctrinating their students? Do they hate social emotional learning? No. According to this survey that went out across the state of Ohio, families support a whole child approach to education. So when you hear this narrative in national news and here in Ohio, that we don't want social emotional learning, we absolutely do want social emotional learning, and that our families trust our educators to teach age-appropriate content and to be role models to our students, and they support mental health priorities. And if you look down here at the very bottom, families absolutely support free school meals because our children cannot learn if they're hungry. Okay, so just wanted to level set. This is what we should be doing, and this is what we should be focusing on. Okay, so now we're gonna take the 1,000-foot view. Why am I even here right now? So we're gonna explain how we got here. A lot of these current attacks, because this is cyclical, this happens in waves, these attacks on public education by differing parties but with the same agenda. This most recent attack started back in the summer of 2020 after the brutal, racialized police murder of George Floyd, and there was a national, I'll take that out even further, international racial awakening and awareness of who we are as a nation, who we think we are, and who we actually are, and where we are on the spectrum in terms of social justice and racial justice. There was a screaming demand for accountability, for education, and for understanding systems of government and holding those systems of government and the people in those seats accountable for what is and is not happening. When the people started demanding this information, particular political operatives started getting a little bit nervous about this demand for information and accountability and started pushing back on that. Chris Rufo, Google him, he got in the ear of former President Trump and started talking about we need to start to tamp this energy down. Coming out of that conversation came the first executive order that former President Trump put out that was banning DEI or any federal funding of DEI in any federal government spaces. This is what kind of started what we're sitting in right now. And if you look at the language that's in that executive order, that exact language is in a lot of the bills, education bills that are living around the country and that are living in our own state house right now. From there, jump ahead a little bit to the general election when there was a referendum on the MAGA, on the MAGA agenda, and the parties flipped. But all of that hate and energy pushing back on honest education had already started. And even though the parties in the state house flipped, this had already started. And by the time January 2021 came around, there was this national extremist agenda to kind of push back on this advancement for racial and social justice and honest education that was already happening. And we saw this in terms of legislation coming out against honest education. We saw that in terms of censorship. We saw a lot of things coming out and attacking democracy because folks didn't like how the election results turned out in November of 2020. We saw attacks on reproductive health care, climate justice, and then the first two censorship bills hit Ohio in May of 2021. That opened a floodgate for several more to come in. By the end of December of 2020, we had nearly 24 bills sitting in our state house attacking public education. And a lot of those bills were copycat bills. They're model legislation that were imported into Ohio. And Governor DeSantis in Florida were just really digging their claws into that. And now they've kind of become the leader in the race to the bottom. And they're dragging our children and our educators down with them. And today, this is what public education looks like in Ohio. It's not about fully funding public education. It's not about making sure that our teachers have the resources and staffing that they need in their classrooms. It's not about making sure that our struggling students that are sitting in a national mental health crisis have the support and care that they need. No, we're sitting in classrooms in school districts with this garbage. This is what is occupying our legislators' time, and honestly, all of my time right now, and your time. Those gerrymandered seats, those gerrymandered politicians, those gerrymandered legislators are happily importing all of this garbage instead of fully funding public education. And this is what it looks like across the country. These are some heat maps where we've kind of broken down what some of these attacks look like. Since September of 2020, there were more than 670 anti-critical race theory laws that were introduced and or passed, whether it was in public education, whether it was in corporate America, in a myriad of different spaces. Censorship bills in K-12 spaces since January of 2021 in our last legislative session. Almost the entire country at that point had some kind of censorship legislation introduced in their state, and some of it had passed. And now, and this is new on our radar, these higher education destruction bills, which is keeping me very busy and awake at night right now. This is a new wave. As of April, 31 bills in 18 states banning DEI in higher ed, banning any kind of grouping policy, program, majors based on identity, based on race, based on gender identity, based on sexuality. Think about what that means. That means no Black student union groups. That means no Jewish faith groups on higher ed campuses. And when we're talking about banning things based on gender, we're talking about gender-based Greek life. We're talking about sororities and fraternities. So the implications of this, we're talking about safe LGBTQ plus spaces for our students as well. These bills are also banning academic relationships with different countries. So these are inherently racist at their core. The bill that's sitting in Ohio bans academic relationships with China, inflaming this anti-AAPI hate, which I live at the center of. And this I want you to look at this number. 474 bills across the country have been introduced to target and harm LGBTQ+ children, teens, adults, and entire communities since January. This isn't since last year. This is since the month of January. And several of these bills are in the state of Ohio. And the amount of self-harm and trauma that this is causing our students, and then inciting other people to inflict physical harm and emotional abuse, essentially giving them license, because we've got legislators that are codifying this hate and harm, is astounding. And to think that we've got legislators that were lawfully elected into our state house that are intentionally targeting some of the most marginalized and vulnerable children in our school districts is disgusting. Okay, so now let's zoom in. Okay, so this is where I'm living these days. This is what's sitting in our state house right now. And these are all bills that were imported, again, based on model legislation that were imported into the state of Ohio for the 135th General Assembly. I do want you to know that in the last General Assembly, why our coalition and league wrapped its arms around us, why we came into existence, all of the bills that were sitting in the State House targeting public education, collectively, we were all successfully able to defeat, and none of them made it across the finish line. And that's because we all worked together. Over 24 bills we were all able to fight. Sadly, several of those have gotten a facelift and have been retread, and we're seeing many of those. In fact, we've probably got over 24 at this point, and they are coming in fast and furiously. And some of them, we know that the Senate is trying to hardwire some of these bills and the language into the state budget. So we are white knuckling this budget session. Thankfully, the House wasn't as ugly as they could have been. There was a lot of harm reduction that happened thanks, to a lot of closed door conversation, a lot of open door conversations that happened. But we're really concerned about what's going to happen in the Senate. Some important things to understand about these attacks is that these attacks are specifically designed to disrupt and dismantle public education as we know it. The ultimate goal, and this is so important, the ultimate goal is to create this white flight out of public education into privatized education using public school dollars. Follow the money. It seems like these are attacks on identity and attacks on race and culture. No, that's just a lever. This is always about money. Follow the money. Why a white flight out of public education? Because there are very specific dark interests that are trying to resegregate schools. Again, causing this flight out of public education. And also all of this noise, that last slide that I showed you, is to distract us from the real issues of public education right now. Again, fully funding public education. And how are they doing this? With this legislation, weaponizing race, identity, and faith, continuing this othering and perpetuating hate of people that may not live in our communities, may look different than us, love different than us, the family dynamics look different, and because we don't know, it's really easy to get in there and fill voids with hate and fear and to make that metastasize and grow. Also, villainizing educators and staff. Suddenly our educators are indoctrinating students because they want to teach about current events, because they want to teach about the full breadth of the nation's histories, the high points and the low points. The pieces that make us uncomfortable are the pieces that make us grow. And then a lot of these bills also, they're layered with a lot of very draconian penalties. but the language is so vague that teachers don't necessarily know what qualifies as a violation. So they get so afraid to violate, get their districts in trouble, get their school in trouble, get themselves in trouble, have an entire community show up with pitchforks and burning crosses in their yards. So they just completely push away from the table because they don't want the heat, the literal heat on them. So that casts this chilling effect on education. And our students end up suffering from that. And all of this, the vehicles for all of this, is all of this garbage legislation that you see here over to the right. Again, we've got I'm not gonna go through all these bills because there's a lot more. I've got flyers over here. What we have done to keep up with all of these bills is we built a legislation tracker page on our website where we have a page dedicated to each one of our bills. We break down the bill and we translate it so that it's not that dry text that you see in the original bill text. And then we provide different ways that you can take action around those bills. You can contact the committee members, write testimony about that. We track where the bills are in their life cycle, in the committees, in the chambers. What I do want to point out here is I'm just going to go over the big buckets that we're following. This censorship and indoctrination legislation. There is indoctrination happening in the state of Ohio, but it's not honest education that's doing it. In fact, we're trying to use honest education to undo the indoctrination of this very limited understanding of our history and how our history continues to impact and inform how we live today. So there is an indoctrination that has been happening. And then the next big bucket are these attacks on our LGBTQ plus students. There's this new wave around education governance, this what we call a state takeover of public education. We have 2 bills. This is how important it is to our state house. 2 parallel bills to move the Department of Education and the State Board of Education into the lap of the governor so that our public education system is controlled by partisan political interests. And not only are they moving ODE and State Board into the lap of the governor, they're also stripping significant roles and responsibilities from the State Board of Education away from the State Board so that they're essentially not doing anything in terms of developing and guiding and prioritizing how public education should look for the state of Ohio. They're essentially doing housekeeping work for the Department of Education. And then there's, you all know this, there's another bucket around education funding and private schools and trying to create these different types of universal voucher programs, either through education students accounts or expanding Ed Choice so that every student across Ohio would be eligible for these Ed Choice vouchers, again, off the backs of public school funding. And then we've got these other bills that are attacking education licensing, education profession also. The ones that you see here in yellow are very important because these bills are moving next week. And I'll kind of jump into what that looks like when I get to the take action slide. I do want to quickly explain what each of these bills are. SB 83, 151, those are those 2 higher education bills that I told you that are banned, and I have a flyer over here with a lot more information about it. Essentially banning required DEI, banning academic relationships with China, banning any kind of grouping program, no women's studies courses. What? No African diaspora courses, no Asian studies courses. So that's what that bill is. And this bill was moving pretty quickly in the Senate, and now next week there's an opponent hearing for the House version of this bill. Senate Bill 117 is another higher ed bill that is using this intellectual diversity in quotes that's layered in the Education Destruction Act, and this bill is trying to create intellectual diversity centers in Ohio State University and University of Toledo, and these centers would be designed to teach what the Constitution actually means and to ground it in a very specific perspective around Western civilization values, with the goal to create the next generation of legal minds and legal scholars. And when we stop here, I'm going to share with you one of the organizations that's kind of underneath this, which is guiding this next bill, House Bill 103. House Bill 103 is a bill that wants to create a task force to revise our K-12 social studies standards. And they want to, on this task force will be appointees from the governor, from the Senate president, and from the speaker. Very, very bipartisan, clearly. And they are going to define what our social studies standards look like based on the American Birthright curriculum, which I'm going to show you in just a second. And we just had a proponent hearing on HB 103 this week, which I encourage you all to watch, so you really have an understanding of what this curriculum looks like. And then Senate Bill 17 is a bill that's requiring free market capitalism be taught in our high school financial literacy standards. What could go wrong? There are 10 concepts that are specifically outlined in what is considered free market capitalism in this bill, and it is a very friendly look at capitalism and doesn't talk about any of the cons or any of the negatives of capitalism. It is not a balanced look at capitalism at all. If you're going to teach about free market capitalism, teach about all of it, the pros and cons, and historically, what was the main engine of our capitalistic society if we want to talk about slave labor several hundred years ago. Let's talk about it. If we're going to talk about capitalism, let's talk about it. Okay. So this is a flyer that's sitting over here, and this is just giving you a little bit more information about the Destruction Act, which is going to be live next week. What I do want to say about this bill, and this is some light in a lot of dark news, is we just recently had the opponent hearing for Senate Bill 83 about, I want to say it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. I feel like I'm in a fever dream. I haven't stopped moving since then. We were able to turn out over 500 professors and educators to show up for that hearing. The hearing started at 4 o'clock and it ended at almost midnight. And almost everyone stayed to make sure that their voice was heard at that podium. I stayed there. I think I left the State House at like 11:50 p.m. and there were students sitting next to me from Akron that refused to leave until they were able to stand up at that podium and look those senators in the eye and tell them how much they hated this bill. Over 500 people. Senator Serino started the hearing by saying that we had broken state Senate history with the turnout in the Senate against this bill, and wore that as a badge of honor. He was so proud that so many people had turned out to talk about his bill. Not proud, not proud of the fact that there was so much hate, just that he had created so much civic engagement energy around his bill. There has since been a sub-bill that's been introduced, so it went from bad to worse. The House version, there was a proponent hearing for that just yesterday, I want to say, and both of these bills are identical at this point. And Senate Bill 83 is probably going to get hardwired into the Senate budget. They've already talked about that, and they've already talked about hardwiring the state takeover into the Senate budget as well. Great. And I don't know if you all remember, but in lame duck last year, the Senate had tried to push through the state takeover of public education in December, and we were able to beat it back. So the Senate kind of has an axe to grind about getting this win, because they didn't like taking the L. Okay, this is the American Birthright curriculum. This is very important. The same people that are responsible for this curriculum were also on the short list of people that were giving proponent testimony for the higher ed bills that I just showed you. This is all connected. And they're also tied to those intellectual diversity centers on the OSU campus and on the campus of Toledo. So we need to understand that these aren't just legislators that are importing this bill. There are big organizations that are deeply funded and deeply coordinated that are orchestrating a lot of this. In fact, this group held a big conference not too long ago where they invited legislators to come and learn about their curriculum, put them up in hotels and fed them and gave them binders around what this look at, this is verbatim what is in their curriculum, if you can read that. And those are the standards that they want to set in Ohio. And this bill is probably going to have opponent hearing next week. We need to get the word out about this and tell people what our legislators are trying to do to public education. This is indoctrination. And the thought that in the bill it is written we are trying to create the next legal minds and legal scholars using this is terrifying. Okay, so that's enough about the state board. Now we're going to jump over to the State Board of Education. I feel like I'm probably over time. And I just want to put this on your radar. The State Board of Education is so important. The State Board of Education determines the priorities, the policies, and the pace at which the Department of Education moves. The Department of Education administers across more than 610 school districts across the state. So the state board decides and tells, kind of shapes the movement of ODE. State board is super important. What we know is there are these two bills trying to overtake state board and ODE, which is very concerning. What we also have to be concerned with is we have 19 State Board of Ed members. 11 are elected, 8 are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, excuse me. We have some extremists on that state board. And